He was the man who sold a war to an entire nation. The Prime Minister who came to believe that a preemptive strike against the United States wasn't just an option. It was Japan's destiny. Under his leadership, state violence and mass killings were unleashed, all in the name of a fervent, radical nationalism. But to truly understand the cataclysm of the Pacific War, we have to look past the caricature of a simple tyrant. The story of Hideki Tojo isn't about a dictator who seized absolute power. It's about a bureaucrat, a product of his time, who climbed a ladder of political chaos to become the face of his nation's most fateful choice, a decision that would ultimately lead to the ruin of an empire. So to get to the heart of Pearl Harbor, we first have to understand the man who paved the road there. How did this one man, a stern and ruthlessly efficient soldier, come to hold the destiny of millions in his hands? It's a journey that starts not in the halls of power, but in the rigid, militarized world of Meiji-era Japan, a society where boys were trained from birth to become soldiers and offer their lives for their divine emperor. Hideki Tojo was born in Tokyo on December 30th, 1884, the son of a lieutenant general in the brand new Imperial Japanese Army. His family came from the samurai, the warrior class that had dominated Japan for centuries. Even though the caste system was officially gone, the samurai ethos was alive and well, shaping the values of the new Japan. Tojo's father, Hidenori, ran his house with military discipline, instilling in his son a deep commitment to Japan's martial traditions. The world Tojo was born into was spinning through radical change. After centuries of isolation, Japan had thrown its doors open to the world, sparking a frantic race to modernize. But this embrace of the West was also filled with anxiety. A huge part of this national project was creating a powerful, modern military, based largely on the Prussian and German armies. The whole education system was geared toward one goal: turning boys into soldiers who saw the emperor as a living god. For a young Hideki Tojo, war wasn't a political failure. It was a sacred duty. To die for the emperor was the greatest honor a man could achieve. He enrolled in the Army Cadet School in 1899, following the path his family and society had laid out for him. He wasn't a brilliant student, often called stubborn and bullheaded, but he was relentlessly hardworking. In 1905, he graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and became a second lieutenant. His graduation happened to line up with the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Japan had scored a shocking victory against a major European power, but the peace treaty, brokered by the United States, felt like a betrayal to many in Japan. They believed President Theodore Roosevelt had cheated Japan out of the territory it deserved. For Tojo and his generation, this planted the first seed of resentment toward America, a nation he would later see as materialistic, soft, and an obstacle to Asia's rise. After a brief tour in Siberia during the Russian Civil War, Tojo's career took a sharp turn when he was sent to Germany as a military attaché from 1919 to 1922. There, he soaked up the latest German military theories, especially the idea of the Wehrstaat, or defense state. This was the concept that for a future total war, the entire nation, its economy, politics, and people, had to be organized for military purposes. It would become a cornerstone of his ideology. On his way home, he made his one and only visit to the United States. A train ride across the country left him unimpressed. He saw Americans as a people driven by pleasure and money, a stark contrast to Japan's superior spiritual values. That experience, plus America's 1924 Immigration Act banning Asian immigration, cemented his view that the West would never treat Japan as an equal. Throughout the 1920s and early 30s, Tojo steadily climbed the army's ranks. He wasn't a charismatic leader on the front lines, but a skilled and tireless administrator. He got a reputation for his sharp, decisive mind and his stern, uncompromising nature, earning him the nickname Kamisori, the Razor. He was known for his efficiency and his unwavering enforcement of discipline. His career took a dark and pivotal turn in 1935 when he was given command of the Kempeitai of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army was the elite Japanese force in northeastern China, which Japan had invaded in 1931 to set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Kempeitai were the army's military police, but in Manchuria, they were something far more sinister, a secret police force, often compared to the Nazi Gestapo. Under Tojo's command, the Kempeitai became the iron fist of the occupation, turning Manchuria into a police state. He was in charge of crushing dissent, rooting out spies, and enforcing the Kwantung Army's brutal colonial rule. His time in Manchuria hardened him, putting him right at the center of Japan's aggressive expansion. He became a key figure in an army that was acting more and more on its own, often defying the civilian government back in Tokyo. The experience cemented his belief that military force was the ultimate tool of national policy, and that Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia. He even led operations against Chinese forces in Inner Mongolia, his only real combat experience, which proved his capability and won him support among military hardliners. By the time he was recalled to Tokyo, Tojo wasn't just a career officer anymore. He was a proven administrator of conquest and a powerful voice for military supremacy. The Japan that Tojo returned to in the mid-1930s was a nation in turmoil. The decade is often called Japan's Dark Valley, a time when a fragile democracy crumbled under the weight of economic crisis, political assassinations, and the rising power of the military. The Great Depression had hit Japan hard, fueling social unrest and a deep distrust of political parties and the zaibatsu, the giant industrial conglomerates, which were seen as corrupt and self-serving. In this climate of chaos, the military presented itself as the only clean institution that could defend Japan and purify the nation. Within the army itself, a bitter and violent power struggle was raging between two major factions. On one side was the Kodoha, or Imperial Way faction. Made up of mostly junior officers, the Kodoha was radical and ultra-nationalist. They believed in a spiritual, revolutionary path, pushing for a coup to overthrow the government, get rid of corrupt politicians, and restore direct imperial rule. They were fiercely anti-communist and saw the Soviet Union as the main enemy, favoring a strike north strategy, or Hokushinron. Opposing them was the Toseiha, or control faction. This group was made up of more senior, conservative officers, including Tojo. The Toseiha was just as militaristic and expansionist, but they were more pragmatic. They believed that the next war would be a total war, and it would require mobilizing the nation's entire industrial capacity with the help of the bureaucracy and the zaibatsu. They rejected the idea of a violent internal coup and instead wanted to take control of the government from within. They also favored a southern expansion strategy, or Nanshin-ron, targeting China and the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. This wasn't just a debate, it was a shadow war, fought with assassinations. The climax came on February 26, 1936. Over 1,400 soldiers from the Kodoha faction staged a coup attempt in Tokyo. They assassinated several high-ranking officials and seized control of the city center, claiming they were acting for Emperor Hirohito. But the emperor was outraged by the murder of his advisors and ordered the military to crush the rebellion. Tojo, now in Manchuria, acted decisively. He opposed the rebels and ordered the arrest of any officers in the Kwantung army who sympathized with the coup. His loyalty and firm stance against the Kodoha rebels marked him as a key figure in the victorious Toseiha. In the aftermath, the army was purged of Kodoha officers. The Toseiha emerged as the dominant force, and with its rivals gone, it gained almost total control over the military. Tojo was one of the biggest beneficiaries. He was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army in 1937 and, a year later, recalled to Tokyo as Vice Minister of War. The chaos of the 1930s had cleared his path to power. He had successfully navigated the army's treacherous internal politics, proving his loyalty and skill. Now, he was perfectly positioned to put the Toseiha's vision of total war into action. In July 1940, Hideki Tojo's ascent continued when he was appointed Minister of War in the government of Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. Prince Konoe, a civilian aristocrat, chose Tojo to make sure the army backed his foreign policy. Tojo was seen as a man who represented the army's hardline views, but was still considered reasonable enough to work with. It was a fateful appointment that put one of Japan's most aggressive militarists in direct control of the army at a moment of escalating global crisis. As war minister, Tojo immediately started to put his ideology into practice. He was a passionate advocate for strengthening the alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, playing a key role in pushing Japan to sign the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, which formally created the Axis powers. Tojo saw this as more than just a strategic move. It was part of a global ideological war against the liberal, democratic values of the West. His main focus, though, was the ongoing war in China, which had exploded into a full-scale conflict in 1937. Tojo rejected any idea of compromise. Instead, he pushed for an even more aggressive expansion. When France fell to Germany in 1940, Tojo saw a golden opportunity. He pushed for the occupation of French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to cut off supply routes to the Chinese and to secure a strategic foothold for a push into Southeast Asia. This move proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. For years, Washington had watched Japan's aggression in China with growing alarm. The occupation of French Indochina was the final straw. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration took a step that would set Japan and the United States on an inescapable collision course. On July 26, 1941, the United States issued an executive order freezing all Japanese assets. Britain and the Dutch East Indies quickly did the same. This action effectively stopped almost all trade between Japan and the Western powers. Then, on August 1st, Washington delivered the knockout blow: a full embargo on the export of oil and gasoline to Japan. The American oil embargo was a mortal threat. Japan had almost no natural resources of its own and depended entirely on foreign imports. Over 80% of its oil came from the United States. Without it, the Imperial Japanese Navy estimated it had less than 2 years of fuel left. The war machine that had conquered Manchuria and was now bogged down in China was in danger of grinding to a halt. The embargo left Japan's leaders with a stark choice: Either give in to American demands, which included a complete withdrawal from China and Indochina, or seize the resources they needed by force. For hardliners like Hideki Tojo, giving in was unthinkable. It would mean the end of the empire's ambitions, a humiliating retreat that would be seen as a profound dishonor. As war minister, Tojo stood firmly against any compromise. In the tense cabinet meetings that summer and fall, Prime Minister Konoe tried to find a diplomatic way out. He even sought a personal meeting with President Roosevelt. But Tojo and the military leadership actively sabotaged these efforts. He argued that talks were a waste of time, and that the United States was just trying to strangle Japan into submission. If Japan didn't act now, he insisted, its oil reserves would dwindle to nothing, leaving it powerless. The pressure mounted. The military set a deadline for diplomacy. If no deal was reached by mid-October, they argued, war was the only option left. Konoe, unable to find a diplomatic opening and unwilling to lead the nation into a war he felt was unwinnable, was cornered. The army, led by the stubborn war minister Tojo, refused to budge. On October 16, 1941, feeling he had lost control of his own government, Prince Konoe and his entire cabinet resigned. Japan was leaderless, standing on the precipice. The stage was now set for the architect to take full command. With Konoe's government gone, the job of picking the next prime minister fell to the senior advisors around Emperor Hirohito. They needed a leader who could control the army, but also one who was completely devoted to the emperor. On October 17, 1941, their choice was made. Hideki Tojo. The Razor became the 40th Prime Minister of Japan. He kept his job as Minister of War and would later take on several other cabinet posts, concentrating an immense amount of power in his own hands. The very men who appointed him hoped that his famous discipline and loyalty might actually make him rein in the military. They were gravely mistaken. Tojo's appointment didn't restrain the army. It unleashed it. He immediately pledged his government to creating a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a nice-sounding name for a Japanese-dominated Asian empire. The final, frantic weeks of diplomacy were a total charade. While Japanese diplomats in Washington went through the motions, the real decisions were being made in Tokyo. Tojo dominated the cabinet, relentlessly pushing the case for war. He argued that the American oil embargo was an act of aggression that left Japan no choice but to fight for its very survival. Any more delay, he insisted, would only weaken Japan as its fuel ran out, while the United States grew stronger. On November 5th, at an Imperial conference, the decision was made. Japan would go to war with the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands if diplomacy failed by early December. Emperor Hirohito, despite some initial reluctance, gave his consent. The next day, Fleet Admiral Osami Nagano explained the details of the planned surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the emperor. The final nail in the coffin of peace was the Hull Note, an American proposal delivered on November 26th. It demanded a complete Japanese withdrawal from all of China and Indochina. To the Japanese leadership, this was an ultimatum, a demand for unconditional surrender. They saw it as proof the Americans weren't negotiating in good faith. A majority of leaders advised the emperor that accepting the note would destroy the fruits of the China incident, endanger Manchuria, and undermine Japanese control of Korea. On December 1st, Emperor Hirohito gave his final authorization for the attack. Tojo was the driving force behind this decision. He wasn't a lone dictator, but he was the most powerful voice in a government now completely dominated by the military. He had outmaneuvered the doves, silenced dissent, and presented war as the only honorable path forward. The bureaucrat had become the warmonger, and he was now directly responsible for ordering the attack that would set the Pacific on fire. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was, at its core, a monumental gamble. It was a strategy born not from careful planning, but from desperation, overconfidence, and a staggering misunderstanding of the enemy. Critically, Hideki Tojo and his military clique took Japan to war with no clear idea of how they could actually win it. There was no real endgame, no realistic plan for how to bring the conflict to a successful close. The Japanese leadership was betting on a few flawed assumptions. They believed that a swift, devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, followed by a rapid conquest of Southeast Asia, would shock the American public. They saw the United States as a decadent, materialistic society that wouldn't have the stomach for a long, bloody war so far from home. They figured that, faced with a string of early defeats, Washington would be forced to negotiate a peace that left Japan in control of its new empire. This was a catastrophic misreading of the American psyche and its enormous industrial power. Japanese leaders just didn't get that an attack like Pearl Harbor wouldn't intimidate the United States. It would unite it in a furious quest for vengeance. They were blinded by their own ideology of spiritual superiority, the belief that the Yamato spirit of the Japanese soldier could overcome any material disadvantage. Emperor Hirohito's role in all this is still a subject of intense debate. Under the Constitution, he was the supreme commander, and the war was waged in his name. He personally approved the war plan on November 5th and gave his final authorization on December 1st. He wasn't a passive observer. He attended military meetings, asked questions, and ultimately sanctioned the attack. But the political structure of the time often made him the final approver of decisions made by his ministers, rather than the one driving policy. While he held ultimate authority, he was heavily influenced by his military advisors, led by the forceful Tojo. After the war, Hirohito would distance himself from the decision, but in the fall of 1941, he gave his blessing to the gamble. On December 7, 1941, the dice were rolled. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, scoring the stunning tactical victory they had hoped for. At the same time, Japanese forces launched attacks across Southeast Asia. The initial phase of Tojo's war was a spectacular success. For a brief, shining moment, the architect's dangerous decision seemed to have paid off. The road to war was paved with a complex mix of ideology, political failure, and the ambition of men like Hideki Tojo. Understanding these historical forces is more important than ever. If you're getting value from this deep dive into wartime leadership, please take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It really helps us continue to bring these critical stories to light. Now, let's get back to the war that Tojo unleashed. For the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's military seemed invincible. The rising sun flag was flying over the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and a huge part of the Pacific. At home, Tojo's popularity soared. He was the triumphant leader who had defied the West and made Japan the dominant power in Asia. He consolidated his power even further, serving as Prime Minister, Army Minister, and at different times as Home Minister, Foreign Minister, Education Minister, and more. As Education Minister, he pushed for even greater militaristic indoctrination in schools, doubling down on the totalitarian policies he had long championed. But the tide of war can turn in an instant, and Japan's early victories couldn't hide the weakness of its position. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a devastating turning point. The loss of 4 of its best aircraft carriers crippled the Imperial Navy and shattered its ability to attack. From that point on, Japan was on the defensive. Even as the war turned against him, Tojo continued to dictate Japan's strategy. By late 1942, he was struggling for control of the army with his own chief of staff, forcing conferences to be held in the emperor's presence just to bolster his own authority. As the war dragged on, his plans became more and more detached from reality. For 1944, he planned a series of massive, decisive campaigns, including Operation Ichigo in China, and a plan to draw the American fleet into one final battle. He seemed to believe that one more major American defeat would be so devastating that the United States would finally sue for peace. By this point, however, even Tojo privately admitted that total victory was impossible. His goal was no longer to win, but to secure a negotiated settlement, a compromise peace that he could still sell as a victory to the Japanese people. But the United States, now fully mobilized and advancing across the Pacific, was committed to one thing: Japan's unconditional surrender. Tojo was waging an unwinnable war, trapped by the very conflict he had started. The gamble had failed, and the architect's creation was about to collapse around him. The beginning of the end for Hideki Tojo came in the summer of 1944. The island of Saipan, a critical linchpin in Japan's inner defense ring, was under attack. Tojo had publicly staked his reputation on its defense, promising the Japanese people that the Americans would never take it. The Battle of Saipan, which began on June 15th, was exceptionally brutal, but the outcome had already been sealed. In the preceding Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy's carrier air groups were annihilated, leaving the soldiers on Saipan isolated and exposed. After 3 weeks of savage fighting, American forces secured the island on July 9th. The fall of Saipan was a catastrophe for Japan. For the first time, the war had reached what was considered Japanese home territory. More importantly, Saipan was close enough for the new American long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers to launch direct air raids against Japan's home islands. The war was no longer a distant conflict. It was about to be brought home to Tokyo. The shockwave from Saipan's fall hit the highest levels of the government. The loss of the island was an undeniable failure, and the blame fell squarely on the man who had gathered more power than any other: Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. His strategy had failed, his promises were broken, and his leadership was now a liability. This is where we see the crucial difference between Tojo and a true dictator like Adolf Hitler. Tojo's power wasn't absolute. It depended on the support of the military and political establishment. As long as he delivered victories, he was secure. But now, facing a catastrophic defeat, his support evaporated. Senior statesmen, the same advisors who had put him in power, began to move against him. They saw him as a disaster for the nation. Tojo tried to reshuffle his cabinet to survive, but his key ministers abandoned him. He faced a vote of no confidence from the very people who had enabled his rise. On July 18, 1944, Tojo and his entire cabinet were forced to resign. The Razor, the architect of the Pacific War, was unceremoniously cast aside. His removal couldn't stop the war he had started, but for him, the game was over. After his resignation, Tojo vanished from public life, watching from the sidelines as the empire he led was systematically destroyed. American B-29s, flying from the very islands he had failed to defend, firebombed Japan's cities into ash. By August 1945, Japan was on its knees. But the military leadership was still fanatically committed to fighting to the last man, woman, and child. It took two events of unprecedented destruction to finally break the deadlock. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, and a second atomic bomb obliterated Nagasaki. Faced with utter annihilation, Emperor Hirohito took the extraordinary step of intervening directly. He overrode his military advisors and denounced Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. With the war over, the Allied occupation of Japan began, led by the American General Douglas MacArthur. One of his first priorities was to bring Japan's wartime leaders to justice. On September 11th, he ordered the arrest of dozens of suspected war criminals. At the top of the list was Hideki Tojo. When American military police arrived at his Tokyo home, Tojo tried to take his own life. He had a doctor mark a spot over his heart, but when he fired the pistol, the bullet missed and lodged in his stomach. As he lay bleeding, the press photographers who burst in allegedly put the gun back in his hand for a dramatic photo before he was rushed to an American hospital. He survived. The Americans who saved him did so for a reason. They didn't want him to escape justice through an honorable suicide. As he wavered between life and death, he was defiant. "I wait for the righteous judgment of history." His day of reckoning was postponed, but it was coming. He was moved to Sugamo prison to await his trial. The man who once held the fate of an empire was now a prisoner, scorned by some of his own people for his failed suicide, and branded a war criminal by the victors. In May 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East began in Tokyo. Modeled after the Nuremberg trials, it was established to prosecute Japan's top leaders for war crimes. 28 high-ranking officials were charged with crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Hideki Tojo was the central figure, the public face of Japanese aggression. Throughout the long trial, the prosecution portrayed him as the mastermind behind the war, a ruthless militarist responsible for the deaths of millions. He was charged with waging wars of aggression and ordering the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war, and was held responsible for atrocities committed by the Japanese army across Asia. In his defense, Tojo was unrepentant. He accepted full responsibility for his actions during the war, but argued that Japan had acted in self-defense against the aggressive policies of the West, particularly the American oil embargo. He claimed the war was fought to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, and crucially, he argued that he was simply a loyal subject acting on behalf of his emperor. This defense helped shield Emperor Hirohito, whom General MacArthur had decided not to prosecute in order to ensure a smooth occupation and the stability of post-war Japan, a decision that remains controversial to this day. After a trial lasting 2.5 years, the verdicts were delivered in November 1948. All of the accused were found guilty. Tojo was found guilty on multiple counts, including waging wars of aggression, and was sentenced to death by hanging. Upon hearing his sentence, he simply bowed to the court. On December 23, 1948, just a week shy of his 64th birthday, Hideki Tojo was executed at Sugamo prison. In his final moments, he shouted, "Long live the Emperor," before the trapdoor fell. His remains were later enshrined at the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, alongside over 2 million of Japan's war dead, including more than 1,000 other convicted war criminals. The architect had faced his final judgment, but the verdict of history would be far more complex. So, was Hideki Tojo the architect of Japan's most dangerous decision? The answer is yes, but it is not that simple. He was, without a doubt, a central figure. An aggressive militarist who, as war minister and then prime minister, consistently pushed Japan down the path to Pearl Harbor. His bureaucratic efficiency and his domination of the cabinet in the critical months of 1941 make him directly responsible for the final, catastrophic choice. But he was not a dictator like Hitler. He didn't create the conditions that led to the war. He was a product of them. He rose to power in a system where democracy had already failed, where the military held immense political power, and where a radical, expansionist ideology had taken deep root. He was the most prominent face of a powerful military clique that saw war as the only answer. His authority was ultimately granted, and then revoked, by that same establishment. The story of Hideki Tojo is a chilling look at how an ordinary, ambitious, and deeply ideological man can become the agent of immense destruction. He wasn't a madman, but a stern, hard-working bureaucrat who fervently believed in his nation's divine mission. And it was that very normalcy, that bureaucratic dedication to a radical cause, that made him so effective and so dangerous. He may have built the road to war, but the materials were already there, forged in a century of upheaval, ambition, and fear. His legacy is one of infamy, forever linked to the atrocities of the Pacific War. But his story forces us to look deeper, beyond the man, to the complex and volatile forces that allow such figures to rise. This leads to a final, troubling question. Where does the responsibility of the architect end? And where does the responsibility of the society that empowered him begin? What are your thoughts on Tojo's role and responsibility? Let us know down in the comments. And if you want to explore more complex figures from history, make sure you're subscribed and have checked out our other videos. Thanks for watching.